The power of positive thinking impresses upon your mind the immediate desire to click the subscribe button. Now. Well, Evleite, Father Andreas, I'm happy to have you with me today. And I think it's a good time to discuss your text, Gazing on God. And this is
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, this is a book that it's a text about icons, or is it? You know, that's kind of what I took from it. How would you describe the book, and why did you decide to write it? I know you and I have fun conversations about art and aesthetics, and what was motivating it?
Well, that's a very good question. In the past, I have written other books or articles about icons in a, let me say, in a more usual perspective. Now, what does that mean? I have written a book on the history and the theology of the icon of the Transfiguration, for instance. But this is, in a sense, a text that would be familiar to the people who have already started studying icons. So it would be something that an art historian or perhaps a theologian might be interested in. In some other texts, such as this book that you mentioned, Gazing on God, I want to do something slightly different, although it is a work that is very much based on research. It has academic expectations, as it were. I wanted to go back a little bit on the narrative of what is an icon and why is it important? What is it doing for us? And these are concepts that we take for granted in the East, in churches such as the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, any of these traditions, because we live with icons. And it is fascinating that when I often have a presentation, when I give a presentation about icons to people here in the UK or in the States, I address Anglicans or Catholics, and I start by telling them that icons, right now you think of them as something Eastern. They used to be part of your own tradition. So they're your own thing as much as it is my own thing as well. And in Gazing on God, I wanted to go a few steps back before I started talking specifically about icons and say something about the aesthetic expectations, or what do icons do? What does iconography do? How does it contribute to spirituality in a way that hopefully makes sense to the average educated believer, perhaps in the Western tradition. I've done some similar projects, I can say, with some slightly different things. Another book where I try to address in exactly this perspective is something that I wrote a few years ago titled "The Sign of the Cross." And once again, crossing ourselves as we do, especially in the Eastern, but also in the Roman Catholic tradition. This is something that once belonged to the entire Christian world, and it's something that we do. We don't think about it. And I thought, well, how can I explain this to a friend of mine? And actually, I had a specific friend of mine as a model for that sort of thing. A friend of mine who is a professor of theology, or Protestant theology in a university in Texas, who is not familiar at all with Eastern theology, but who had a very open mind. So what would I do to explain something like that to my friend there, or to his daughter, who is just about starting to study theology? And actually, as having published a few articles and books in my career already, I have found that the ones that I wrote having a specific person in mind tend to be more successful than the ones that are, let's say, just academic studies, the ones that I just write for myself. It helps me as a writer to imagine that I'm writing something for you specifically, or for somebody who has these specific needs.
That's no, I think that's a great approach. And what I like about the text, and I started by saying, it's a book about icons, ? Right? Like, or is it? And I think the title is very appropriate. I hope it's your title, not the publisher's. But
it is.
okay, good. Yeah, I mean, it's not about the icons per se. I think your set of examples are really interesting, but if you got rid of all of them, you could bring in a whole new set of examples, and it's equally applicable. So it's really about this, call it the divine gaze, or gazing on God, as the title is. But it's preparing, and you do this in the first 4 chapters of the book. You prepare the reader to then make meaningful the conversation about icons. I'd say it feels, I don't know the right way to say it, to capture what I want to say. It feels catechetical, without necessarily being catechetical. Like, I mean, it's, you really do lay the groundwork theologically. And, you mentioned Orthodox people in the East grow up with icons. And I think someone in a Western setting might think, okay, they grow up where there's icons around them. But I could hear what you said, especially after reading your text. It's not growing up with icons in the sense that they're just there, but that they are with us in the same way that they impress the reality of these people or events existing with us. And you start the book off that way with faith and experience, right? Why is faith and experience so important, and why the trajectory that you did with the first couple chapters that they're far more theological, and not just theological. You could call them theology intersects with all those fields, but they lay the groundwork for encountering reality, not just the icon. Wouldn't you say? Or is that what your intent?
Yes, I think you touched on a couple of very important things here, such as experience, and also, as you said it very correctly, that if we were to just get rid of these specific icons, examples, the same thing could have been done with other icons. So by no means this tries to be a systematic presentation of icons. There are several books that try to do that, with varying degrees of success. But if there was a point to be made here, is that people who are not familiar with icons, and also people who think that they're familiar with icons, think of them sometimes as religious decoration. Let's say we can consider the prayer space, the liturgical space, which is the church building. And instead of decorating it with appropriate colors, we decorate it with religious images. That's not what's happening here at all. And one way to speak about icons, first of all, in a liturgical space, in a church, in a worship space, but also at home, is to say that, to recognize rather that they're carriers of the presence of the people they represent, the saints they represent. So in that sense, we think of images as something that we look at. Okay, in this case, the whole semiotics of what is an icon also sets it up for something that is looking towards us. And this is something that I think touches on what you mentioned earlier, that we live, we grow up with icons, not just as part of the extended surrounding, but as if we refer to living presences. From a young age, we develop that kind of relationship with the icon as a presence, not with any type of image, but with icons specifically, even at home. So I think one very important aspect to explain about what is an icon, and not a religious painting, or that's another way to say the same thing, that an icon is not simply a religious painting. It's something very different, something much more than that. It suggests a very specific presence. It's as if Jesus, Mary, Peter, the person who is presented there is somehow present. And that is what gives us a focus to direct our prayer. Of course, we do not worship the paint or the wood itself, but it helps us channel, as it were, our prayer towards them. So the icon as a presence is part of our experience, and experience is what we want to have in mind when we speak about truth in the Christian tradition. It is, I think, very important to remember that Christianity is not a philosophical system. Well, of course, it has many philosophical aspects, many philosophical parts in it. It didn't start as a systematic edifice, systematic philosophy or anything like this. It did not even start, that may sound a little challenging, as a religion, if by religion we consider the organized beliefs of the people who help that society to deal with its metaphysical identity. It started as something very different. It started as a divine revelation, and how that revelation of Jesus Christ became and still is part of our everyday life. So it is something that addresses, first of all, our direct experience. When St. Paul explains this, he says that, well, the Jews seek signs. They want to see some signs that say something about the revelation of God in this way. And Greeks, that means all philosophers, go after religious thought, philosophy. But we don't do one or the other. We preach or we follow Jesus Christ, and he is crucified. So we follow what seems to be the way of weakness, but it's the experience of dealing with that challenge every single day of our life. So that's something about the first thing about icons. The other thing that I want to stress, and not in this book only, but I think every single time I'm giving a lecture about icons or write something about icons, is that when we consider the thought of the past, the theological thought of the past, we usually start with doctrinal proclamations, with sermons, with histories, with things like that. And once again, we think of icons as a surrounding to this serious thought. Mm-hmm. Well, this is not precise, because there are several examples, and some of the examples that we can find in Gazing on God in this book shows that icons are not just the end products of theological thought, but sometimes they are theological thought in a different way. We tend to visualize thought as something that is similar to philosophy or to language. But of course, now we can point to thought in many different ways. We think in images, we think in symbols, we think in different ways, and icons, and of course the liturgical and the dramatic language of the church as well, encapsulates very much that kind of thinking image. So when we go back and examine the tradition of the Christian thought, of the Christian church, it is right, of course, that we look into doctrines, into sermons, into things like that as sources for theological thought. One of my main arguments to say like that as an iconologist is that icons have equal value to all these things as sources and not just as products of theological thought. So that's part of what I was trying to do in this book. In the second part, which goes through some examples of specific icons, which, as you said very correctly, it could be others. I chose some of the ones that seemed a little more easy to open up, and some towards the end, especially the more unusual ones. But I wanted to have an introduction as to how do we set up for experience, openness, a different kind of thought in the Christian tradition. And this is where icons come in and fill that gap.
I think the way that you stage the conversation is really important, especially, that last set of comments, how we now can speak of thinking in images, and it's not bound to language, which nowadays at least we associate with written images, with words that are codified and spelled certain ways, and they have their own history and orthography and etymology, etc. But that there's more to the way we encounter and experience reality, and the way we interface with one another through that common experience. And I found myself like reflecting on how icons sing to me sometimes. So if I'm ever in the presence of certain icons, I'll hear, right, and all these different melodies emerge, and lyrics that they're getting triggered by the way that reality is presented in the icon, or that the icon is presenting reality, I should say, rather than a representation of the historical. And I know you spend a lot of time discussing that contrast, at least in terms of things like the resurrection icon and whatnot. So I wanted to ask you, if you could talk to us just a little bit about what it means to live in the Logos. So you have your second chapter is about the Logos, which we associate with Christ, the Logos of God, right? And I think most folks in the West may not get the conversation you provided, given the backdrop to what this idea is. Could you say a little bit more about, number one, the Logos, but what it means to live in the Logos as it applies to this?
Sure. Now that's one of the most simple and more difficult areas in Christian theology, in biblical theology. And many people may know that the Gospel according to John starts with the phrase, "In the beginning was the," what exactly? Now, the Greek word there is logos, and that most usually is translated as word. But that's a reduction in its meaning, because logos is such an extremely rich word that means many things. It means word, of course. It means speech. So both the speech that has been uttered and the one that has not been uttered yet. It means principle. It means analogy. It means ratio. It means reason, in both understandings of reason, both as in the rationale and the reason that we do something. It means all of those things at the same time. And also as a philosophical concept, it has had a long tenure before Christianity. Perhaps one of the first times we come across logos as a philosophical concept is in the philosophy of Heraclitus, one of the most interesting ancient philosophers. To compare Heraclitus with somebody who is more well known to most people, such as Aristotle, would be similar to comparing a mystic with a scribe.
Right.
Without wishing to insult Aristotle at all. And in fact, I do have a lot of respect for that thought, for that tradition as well. But Heraclitus is trying to do something very different. And the logos for him, with all of these meanings, both as word, as principle, as harmony, as ratio, all those things, is a very central concept in his philosophy. It is something like the hidden harmony, the hidden secret of the entire world. It is interesting, however, that Heraclitus was active in the city of Ephesus, and the tradition of Heraclitus is maintained there for a very long time, for several centuries. Now, there's no accident that John the theologian wrote both the book of Revelation, according to tradition, and the gospel that bears his name in that part of the world. So if he had come in contact with local intelligentsia, with the local theological, philosophical circles, he certainly came across with a philosophical tradition of logos. That's one reason how we can see that it penetrates Christian vocabulary. There's also another interesting background to Logos just before it enters Christian vocabulary, and that is with one of the most forgotten, unjustly forgotten figures in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That is Philo of Alexandria, known as sometimes as Philo the Jew. Now, Philo is extremely important for all Christian tradition because he's probably the first person who thought it would be a good idea to take the tradition of revelation, and that for him, being a Jew, meant what we refer to as the Old Testament, and just oppose it, or actually interpret it using the philosophical language of the time, which mostly for him meant Platonism. So it's the first time that these two are brought together. We could not imagine Christianity without this kind of connection. What we see later, starting of course from the tradition of Alexandria, with people such as Clement and Origen and their descendants, their intellectual descendants, Evagrius and so on, but also the Cappadocians, Basil, the two Gregories, the entire philosophical Christian tradition starts with what Philo does first. So we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. And he's not being Christian, he is not acknowledged by the Christian writers as much as he should have been. It's very few who actually betray their sources and say that, well, I found this idea in Philo. Some do, but not nearly as many as they should have. But the reason I'm saying all this about Philo is that the concept of logos is something he finds in the philosophical tradition, and he gives it a very central place in his own examination of the biblical tradition. So how big is this? One of the most famous passages of Philo is where he talks about the visit of the three angels to Abraham. And he takes this as an entry point to speak about the complexity in God. Well, complexity in what sense? Of course, we know that God is one. There's a unity there. We're not talking about multiple gods. That's very clear in the Hebrew tradition and also in the Christian tradition. Having said that, there is a sense of complexity in God. When God, in the beginning of Genesis, says, "Let us create the world. Let us do this," he speaks in plural about himself. Let us do this. Now, from a Hebrew perspective, this is a little more difficult to explain. From the Christian perspective, it's a little easier because we have been given the revelation of the Trinity.
Right.
Now, Philo does something wondrous from a Hebrew perspective when he talks about that visit of the three angels. And of course, he first wants to talk about the complexity. Now, for Philo, there is a differentiation between the essence of God himself and what he calls the powers of God. There's only one God, but there are many different ways to consider his powers. Of course, the same differentiation is passed to the Orthodox tradition, to the Christian tradition, with the only difference that instead of powers, the usual word that is employed is energies. So the distinction between the essence and the energies of God that we find in Basil, in Maximus, in Gregory Palamas is something that we owe to Philo, and not many people know that. So Philo speaks about the various powers of God, such as the royal power, the creative power, so on, so on. But he says there is one power that stands beyond and above all of them and coordinates them. So it's the one that, in a sense, expresses the presence of God more clearly than any other aspect or power of God. And that power for Philo is the Logos. So he develops a Logos theology that anticipates the Messiah. It is not very clear how messianic expectation played into this in the thought of Philo, but certainly it is consistent with with the prophetic anticipation of the Messiah in the Old Testament. So when Christian theology steps into all this and finds the thought of Philo, well, it's very clear that by logos we mean Jesus Christ. But also one of the interesting things that you asked is, well, yeah, there is a philosophical or theological way to consider logos. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for us today? What does it mean for all creation, for that matter? Well, one of the fascinating things about the logos, about considering Jesus Christ as the logos, is not just to think of him as the second person of the Trinity, the one who was incarnate for our salvation and all that, sure. But the logos is something that connects the creator with every single part of the entire creation. So one way to consider the fallen state of creation is to say that the original touch, the original content, the original meaning of creation was tainted after the fall, and it became unsynchronized from its creator, from God. And one way to describe our trajectory towards salvation is to try to find that harmony with every part of the entire nature, for that matter, not just humanity. And that's fascinating that this kind of theology precedes environmental theology by centuries. So we don't limit this observation only to the Christian church or only to humanity, but to the entire nature, the entire creation, to some extent at least, with the human being as the agent who initiates all this in response to the calling of God, however. So every single part of creation can reflect the presence or the memory of God itself. So this is a way to address in some aspect what you refer to as the significance of living in a logos in a logos life, living with awareness and with the participation of not just ourselves but of every single part of creation as something that came out of the hands of God.
It's easy to see why you would choose not to translate that word when you're reading John, right? In the beginning was man, do I have to say word?
Yeah, exactly. How do we translate that? This is so this is a rich word. What do I do with this? And the choice of word might have been the best one that we can have in the English language. I remember a few years ago I saw, well, I can only describe it as the translation of a translation. But I was made aware of how the Gospel of John was translated into other languages, including some of the Oriental ones. I don't remember if it was in Japanese or in Chinese or one of the language of that family. But the translation there was, in the beginning, was the Zen. Now that was absolutely inspired because the Zen in that part of the world means much more than the word. It means something very similar to the hidden principle, the hidden harmony of the entire creation. So I thought, well, yes, that's much closer to what this is, to what logos means than the word. The word is a necessary choice, but it leaves many of the vital aspects of what logos really means.
Yeah, and the idea of living in the logos in this what did you call it? It's something with cosmological dimensions.
Yeah.
It's not something that we would like to confine. And I think that's the general tension with the way it gets translated is, well, we're kind of left with something that, and I don't know the historical etymology or tradition behind word, verbum, maybe Latin, and what it means. Maybe it has to do with activity, and either way, it's lost on us by now, I think is the point. And that idea of participating in reality at a scale that we have maybe disconnected from seeing, or encountering is a better word. Seeing, right? We're implying the eyes. And as you write in another place, and I think it seems to really cross over into this text too. It's the idea of, well, I mean, you talk about it when you talk about the resurrection icon and how we call him the King of Glory and not the King of the Jews, right? It's not just Jesus of Nazareth, Basileos Yehuda. It's instead, the King of Glory. And so it's perceiving then reality as it ought, or as is more appropriate to the don't want to use big words, but the ontological function of what's being conveyed, or what we're trying to memorialize and participate in actively, at least to actively participate in that sort of memory. So I'm thinking about the way that there's inverted perspective and naturalistic depiction, or naturalist perspective, and why icons then, they don't go after, they're not trying to replicate a moment in time. They're not trying to be a documentary, right? I mean, they have their own way of imaging and creating the world. Could you say a little bit more about inverted perspective, and especially the notion of the mirror, as it applies to, I mean, this is something we saw in, in the early Plato, right? Plato talks about the mirror, and patristic literature too. I know it's very prevalent in the Syriac tradition. From the Syrian has a lot of fascinating poetry about, what a mirror is, and how that that inverted perspective is a way of accessing. I don't want to say portal or door, because then this will go sci-fi. And my sci-fi episodes are coming up in a couple weeks. But in the meantime, right, it's a way of accessing a consciousness, that we probably wouldn't.
One of the most fascinating things in iconography, when we start talking about the technique, things such as you mentioned, the importance of the mirror, or inverted perspective, is that we do not find any manuals that describe what that is. The earliest manual on iconography that we have is as late as, I think, the 18th or 19th century. So in that very long tradition of iconography, we can see different styles, specific ways of approaching space, of symbolism, and yet there doesn't seem to be a theoretical text that that informs them. Nothing as a systematic theory. Now, this can mean two things. Either I think, less likely possibility that there was such a text, or if not a text, an oral tradition among iconographers that explain what we see here, so that the theory of the inverted perspective is something that had existed for some time. Or most likely, because there's no indication, nobody refers to anything like this directly or indirectly, not even to a text, but not even to a, let's say, teaching or a perception among iconographers. So most likely, this means that the way of creating the iconographic space is something that became second nature to iconographers, who were simply following the thought process that they identified in the images. So we spoke earlier about how a thought may be conveyed not just in word, but in different ways, in action, in dramatic terms, in images, in this case. So it seems that the images themselves created that concept of the inverted perspective. So what we mean, what is this, and what does this have with a mirror? It is easier for us to use these concepts now, because we have to consider what the icon is somewhat intellectual. We don't always live with the icon that gives us the answer to questions like that more easily. So to understand how an icon is different from a religious image from any other image. Well, that's why we need concepts like that. So sometimes we see that icons are more correctly understood or described when we don't try to interpret them using the standard visual perspective that we see in any kind of work of art. So what are we talking about? The standard, let's say, Renaissance way of painting a portrait was to paint something that looks like a window, and if you place it next to your real window, you could see out of you could almost confuse what you see out of the window into nature out there and what you see in the picture, the image. So something that could be mistaken perhaps for a real depiction, a realistic, a naturalistic depiction. The icon is never trying to do that. And one thing that we have to keep in mind about the tradition of iconography is that when we look at some of the examples of Hellenistic painting, and the most famous example of this is the tradition of the so-called Fayum portraits. The many funerary portraits that we associate very often with mummies, with sarcophagi, and with cemeteries. Of course, that's a long tradition. It's not just the big collection that was found in the town of Fayum in Egypt. It spans a few centuries. And actually, well, I cannot resist but adding this. For me, it was one of the most impressive things to look at when I visited the Museum of Cairo. There's a section of sarcophagi, and so many sarcophagi of poor people, or not as early as the old pharaohs, and the person was depicted there in precisely this way, in that style. So the interesting thing about the Fayum portraits is that they display all the knowledge of the Renaissance about perspective, chiaroscuro, the source of light. So these people in the Eastern Mediterranean knew how to paint in the naturalist way that we find later in the Renaissance. And therefore, if they created icons that did not seem to have an obvious source of light, or that they seem to ignore the rules of natural perspective, it's not because they didn't know how to paint. They knew very well how to paint. They tried to do something else there. So in that perspective, gives us a couple of paradox observations. It allows us sometimes to observe something such as a cave or a building as if we see the inside, as if we're part of the image ourselves. So this is not something necessarily that you notice the first time you look at an icon, and of course that's how you live with an icon. It's something that grows on you when you see the same icon in the same place of your house or the same place in the church. So the impression of what that thing is something that gains, so we say, in meaning the more you're exposed to it. You don't need to make a formal sort of intellectual observation for this to work in this way. It does. So sooner or later, to put like that, the space of the icon draws you inside it, and you begin to feel like a participant. You begin to feel that like you have a dialogue with the people who are represented there, not just an object placed at some distance for you to look at, but a way of addressing the represented person, and a way that the represented person is also addressing and perhaps answer your own prayers. Now, to connect it with something else that you mentioned before, which is very important about not just icons, but generally the way we understand time in the Orthodox tradition, and festival time especially. You mentioned the Feast of the Resurrection before. And I think that's a very good key for us to understand how time is working in Christian feasts and in icons that take after this understanding as well. Now, there are several different ways to consider an event of huge importance, such as the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, and the first level is to consider it from a historical point of view. Is it something that happened? Is it something that took place in more or less the way that we see described in the Gospels, in the tradition? And the resounding answer to this question in the Christian tradition is yes. It is the foundation very much of the Christian faith. Without this, as St. Paul says, we would not have any basis to claim anything else in Christianity. So there's no doubt as to the historicity of the resurrection. But this is not what is important for the rationale that we find in the icon, or for the way that we celebrate our feasts. The interesting thing about the icon of the resurrection, of the Orthodox icon of the resurrection, is that it does not try to represent the moment of the resurrection as we could have imagined it. So the image of Jesus emerging from the tomb is something that was known to the Easterners since the 9th century, at least. We have some examples of that icon being present, but they showed no interest in developing it. It doesn't say enough. It's just an exploration of the historical resurrection only. And that's not interesting because we don't need proof for this. We know it happened. So what?
Yeah, right.
Instead, and actually I happen to have that kind of icon here next to me, somebody gave it to me. That is the more usual type of resurrection. Now, what do we see in this case? We do not see Jesus Christ emerging from the tomb. We see what is sometimes described as the descent to Hades. Now, that is not an event that is described in any way in the Gospels or in the New Testament. There is perhaps an allusion to something like that in one of the epistles of Peter, that says something about Jesus visiting the spirits in prison. But hard theology would show us that at the moment of the death of Jesus Christ, when he says, "Father, in your hands I commit my spirit," he is with the Father immediately. There's no time really that Jesus spent in the underworld, although sometimes we hear that in the tradition. But the significance of this is the significance of Jesus being in the underworld is not something that has to be confined in a specific time, in, let's say, the days between his crucifixion and his resurrection. What we see instead in this icon and the representation of the descent to Hades is Jesus raising Adam and Eve and the prophets who anticipated his crucifixion and resurrection, and leading them all the way to heaven. Mm-hmm. While he has broken the gates of Hades, he has bound death himself. So we can simply ask, when did that happen? The when is something that we lived back then in the historical resurrection, and since then, every single day of our life. The theme of that icon is not the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but the resurrection of humanity by Jesus Christ. So in this way, the whole technique of the inverted perspective, of mirroring myself to this, of looking at this as a mirror of my present condition, of trying to find myself, starting with my own perspective in the icon. All this tells me that this is a comment, if you wish, or a relation of the here and now, not simply a historical memory from the past. Yes, we're aware of the history, we acknowledge it, but that's not the most interesting thing for us. And this is also reflected in most of festival celebrations. In the majority of our hymnography, of Eastern hymnography, we get a sense of things happening in the present. There's a long prayer that, for instance, that is read during the sanctification of the waters in the Feast of Theophany. And it goes something like, "Today Jesus is descending in the Jordan. Today are the waters sanctified. Today the sea turns back. Today this, today that, today the other thing. So we live this not as historical memory, but in considering what these events mean for our life today. We are there. We are being crucified with Jesus Christ. We're being resurrected with him. We're being baptized with him. He's born inside us all the time. This is the message of immediacy that we find in the tradition, in the hymnography, and very strongly in the icons.
It's a brilliant connection. We do the same thing during the Friday of the Crucifixion service. We have a whole series of chants that begin with Yaumo no, Yaumo no today.
Yep.
And it's everything is happening now, right? It's not, it's not just a meditation on a past event. And
Yep.
so it makes me think, what's the point of history? We can chronicle events, but if they don't have a context that makes them worth remembering or encountering, and in our case, it's encountering, right? It's living in these, what did happen in history still happens, and the icon is a way of engaging, with that event. Let's talk in the time remaining just about a couple of the examples and maybe some of the more obscure ones. Like, I'm really fascinated by the all-seeing eye, the way that God is. I mean, this isn't something that started in the medieval times. I mean, this happened, in the ancient world, that God is represented with an eye. I know that when you saw the first episode of the podcast, you're one of the few people who could understand what I'm doing with this symbol, eye-wise. And so I thought that would be a good icon to discuss, and maybe even its antecedents, right, in the burning bush, or whatever comes before to develop this. And tell us a little bit about it first. I mean, it's a Russian icon, correct?
It is, yes. Now, some of the icons that I talk about can be found in any Christian tradition, in any Orthodox tradition, but towards the end, I said a few things about icons that belong to the Romanian Slavic tradition mostly, and I think the all-seeing eye is a very specifically Russian icon, and it's a very unusual icon. An icon that is not seen very often, and many people, or several of the people who hear the podcast may have no idea what we're talking about, and they may just start Googling it to see what is this icon. And of course, it's fascinating. Now, the reason I was fascinated by that icon, and I wanted to include that kind of an example, is because it's such a non-narrative icon. You don't know what you're seeing, and the more you start reflecting on what you think you see here, what you see there, the more that icon draws you towards some unexpected pathways of discovery of the presence of God. These concentric circles that we find, they point towards an increasing revelation of God. But there's a very interesting thing about that kind of space arrangement. Now, that is not the kind of imagery that we're too familiar with in the Orthodox or in the Christian tradition. We have some more examples, and perhaps the example that is more famous, not as an entire icon, but at least as one component of a known icon, is the glory or the aureole of the Transfiguration,
Right?
Which is also another fascinating topic in itself. But what is fascinating about the icon of the eye is that it's all this mysterious icon, this mysterious symbol. Now, as I said, we don't have many examples like that in the Christian traditions. A tradition example that may be described as a reflective icon, but we can see similar symbols in other traditions. So in this case, I think we can certainly speak about the equivalent of a mandala, of that kind of archetypal space, archetypal imagery that we find in the Indian, in the Buddhist tradition. And the interesting thing about the mandala in these traditions is that their importance is not so much on the image itself, but in the act of reflection that leads to the creation of the image. So it's a process, it's a trajectory. And I think we can see something similar here if we think of this icon, and by extrapolation, many other icons, even the more narrative ones, as inviting us towards a process of continuous discovery.
Yeah, I like that, and how it relates to so many other aspects of, call it theology, where the eye is an awareness of seeing and being seen,
Yep.
you know, of what it means to be, of being watched, right? Where the mirror gazes back, you know, at you, that this icon is not just an object, but it's a way of being seen when it's in your presence. Whether it's this icon or a number of other icons, whether it's about God looking at us, or whether it's about the human being a, you know, this creature able to perceive, right? The ader, who's the anthropos, right? The seeing human, right? The human who is capable of, or the man who is capable of sight, right? And Ephraim the Syrian has some fascinating perspective on this idea, that the idea of a luminous eye, this Iconography, that, you know, once it's opened, you know, can perceive heaven, can perceive the true identity of the self, which is the image and likeness of God, right? And that's it. He incorporates that with a lot of mirror imagery. You know, it's like it's just a poetic version of Athanasius. You know, like content wise, they're very similar, but you know, the idea of finding oneself through cleaning a mirror. Now, those of you listening, thinking mirrors today, it's not the same as the ancient world. Ancient world, you've got a slab of metal that you polish, that tarnishes, right? Think of something like silver. Silver is one of the brightest metals out there. And it also is one of the most tarnished and darkest metals if it's not kept polished and shining. And so Ephraim sees life as this process of keeping the mirror clean, so that when we perceive back, we can see the image of God, you know, which is both about God and us, right? And so I think why I'm fascinated by that example is it's, as you said, it's so relational in what it asks us to do, or the awareness it creates.
There are so many things that we could talk about them for hours. I wanted to find very quickly an image, one of my favorite images of by a modern iconographer, Stamatis Kyrios, that I want to share with you if I can. An icon of Isaac the Syrian, and he has tried to represent him as light. I think I found it. Now, can you see what I'm seeing?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, that's a modern icon of Isaac the Syrian, and I find this fascinating. It's painted in light, but there is so much about there's so much to say about the significance of light, of seeing, of gazing, of what is visible, what is not visible. The whole agony of the human being is to get to see God and to be seen by God, and yet at the same time, it's what terrifies us. The beginning of the Gospel according to John, after all that important thing about the Logos, gets very quickly into God as light, and how the people who wanted to hide their guilt did not want to step into the light. So it seems that this reminds us that the process to salvation, the trajectory, the ways to get towards God, is simply the daring act of being aware of our sinfulness, the parts inside us that have not been clean enough, and yet to not deny access to God, to step into the light with all our deformities, with all our problems, with all our sins. And the assurance that is given by the entire Christian tradition, of course, is that God forgives.
Mhm.
But you have to ask for this forgiveness. You have to ask to be seen by God, not to hide from Him. So how do we do this? If there's no, since the sun was a great symbol for the ancient Egyptians, the source of divinity and light, the sense of mirror is much more accurate for us. And as you said very correctly, as the fathers remind us to clean that mirror. So to keep it clean so that the gaze of God can work within us, because we have nothing to hide, because we don't want to hide anything, even our own sins. So by allowing ourselves to be seen by God, perhaps is how we get to the hope of trying to see God as well.
I love it. And, like the book, that's a great quote. One of the things I came away with while reading the book is I have a number of places highlighted because it's so quotable. Like there's a lot of excellent quotes in that book. And in fact, you may see me posting on that in a short time from now. So like you said, we could talk for several hours, and maybe that just means I'm going to have you back more often. And I thank you a lot for coming on and sharing, the ideas behind this book with us. And I really hope that the listeners out there and people who aren't subscribers, just go ahead and try and get your hands on the book. It's worth having, and it's worth thinking about. It really asks us to provide a new framework for encountering reality, or I would say maybe it's not a new framework, the appropriate framework in our tradition, right?
Well, thank you for saying that, Michael, and thank you for the hospitality.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks. We will talk to you all soon, and grab it where it can be found. I'll include links below. Take care.